Well, good evening and welcome from New York City to Piers Morgan Uncensored. It's difficult to overstate how big of a deal it is back in Britain that Huw Edwards, the face of British news, really, the face of BBC News, has now been named as the presenter at the centre of this huge scandal that's been raging in the last week. In that esteem, he's the face of our state occasions, of royal events. He's the man who announced the death of the late Queen. He's wry, he's authoritative, and above all, he's always been trusted. By all accounts, the audiences love him. I know him personally. He's always seemed to be a very stand-up guy. So today's news that he is the presenter behind the BBC sex picture scandal is a huge shock to everyone that knows him, maybe to his family, certainly to millions of people who are used to watching him on the news each night. Probably a shock to his colleagues at the BBC. For the last 5 days, speculation has raged about the man at the heart of the crisis. Tonight, his wife, Vicky Flynn, a television producer with whom he has 5 children, took the courageous decision to end all that speculation. In a statement, she said, "I'm doing this primarily out of concern for his mental well-being and to protect our children. Huw is suffering from serious mental health issues. As is well documented, he's been treated for severe depression in recent years. The events of the last few days have greatly worsened matters. He suffered another serious episode and is now receiving inpatient hospital care where he'll stay for the foreseeable future. Once well enough to do so, he intends to respond to the stories that have been published." She goes on to confirm that Edwards didn't know about any of these claims until last week. She made a call for privacy, and she adds that Huw is deeply sorry that so many colleagues had been impacted by the speculation. And that's a key point. The speculation was becoming completely unsustainable. Many other male BBC presenters were being shamed and vilified on social media for something they had nothing to do with, and had to, in some cases, publicly deny their involvement. Viewers were bound to notice that Huw Edwards had vanished overnight from the nightly news bulletins. Now, clearly, Huw Edwards is now in a very serious situation. He probably feels like he's losing everything. Whatever the outcome of the investigations, it would be inhuman not to think about the impact of all this on him, on his family, on his mental health. All of those are important things to consider now. But now we can talk freely about who this is. It should also be clearer why it's been such a big story. The Met Police says it has no evidence of criminality, but what remains are allegations about a potentially serious abuse of power by a household name paid handsomely from the public purse. Accused originally of paying tens of thousands of pounds to a teenager with drug problems for indecent images. More claims about his behaviour have followed from 3 other people so far, including allegations made not just to The Sun, but directly to the BBC. And the way the BBC has managed this complaint remains a matter of legitimate public interest and concern. We shouldn't forget the other people involved in this story, because there are a lot. Well, I'm joined now by my pack, the best-selling author of War of the West and columnist Douglas Murray, former Conservative MP Louise Mensch, and the multimillionaire investor, one of the sharks on the American reality tank, Kevin O'Leary. The former executive at Channel 5 and also worked at the BBC, David Elstein. But first, let me start by talking to the former BBC political correspondent and current Times radio presenter, Carol Walker. Carol, thank you so much for joining me. This is an unbelievably complex and difficult story. It has been from the start, because I'm sure you, like me, and most people in the media very quickly discovered that it was Huw Edwards. But that name was not being made public, and as a result, there was this feeding frenzy of speculation driven by social media about who this could be. That was, of course, very damaging to all those concerned. But as somebody who knows Huw Edwards well, what is your reaction to all this turn of events today? The police saying that they found no evidence on that initial story of any crime being committed. And secondly, his wife's decision to go public in naming him and revealing he's having these serious mental health issues in hospital.
Well, I think, to be honest, Piers, my first thoughts are for Huw's family and for Huw himself. He's clearly had a very serious mental health problem. He is being treated in hospital for that. And it must have been an unbelievably difficult time for his wife and the rest of his family. She's clearly taken the decision that she had to speak out tonight. That can't have been easy. And I think that really we do have to respect and understand why she's now asking for some time for the rest of the family to try and ensure that he gets the right treatment and to get on with their own lives. I think the other important thing to say here, Piers, is that, of course, none of the allegations about Huw has actually been proven or established beyond any doubt. The police have now said that they are not going to carry out any sort of investigation. And I think that what we're left with here is, though there are clearly some questions about how the BBC may have handled this, it does underline the complexity of all of this. You know, I worked alongside Huw when he was a rising star as a political correspondent, one of a number of very ambitious and talented BBC figures, including some of those like Jeremy Vine, who found themselves unfairly targeted. And I think that it does also just highlight that issue of how people who are such huge public figures can also then find themselves targets, not just perhaps of some justified complaints, but also of such huge amounts of speculation and rumours, as we've seen over the past few days swirling around on social media.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I don't disagree with any of that. All I would say, though, is there seems to be a sort of growing criticism of the way the Sun has handled this. But to be clear, they didn't name him to start with, and they didn't say that what he'd done was a criminal act. That was others, actually, that were commenting on this potentially straying into the area of criminality. Also, significantly, the BBC themselves have also been exposing their own stories and their own investigation into Huw Edwards' alleged inappropriate conduct. And in fact, today I think there were more revelations from the BBC about his allegedly inappropriate behaviour towards colleagues. So it's not just a tabloid or a Sun-driven scandal in that sense. You've actually had the BBC themselves having journalists investigating and finding what they believe to be, because they've reported it, to be evidence of inappropriate conduct. Where does that leave Huw Edwards, do you think, in terms of his future at the BBC? And what do you feel about the BBC actually in that situation, investigating him in that way?
Well, look, I actually think that the BBC has done a pretty good job on reporting a story which is about one of its own very senior presenters. I think anyone who has watched the BBC coverage over the past few days must really accept and acknowledge that they've managed to treat this as another story. I have worked at the BBC when there are stories about the BBC. I know how difficult it is, but I know that it's also a point of pride for the BBC that its journalists try to set aside the fact that it is one of their own that they're talking about and to treat this as another news story. Now, you and I both now work for competitors, but we'll know what the challenges are in the journalism of this sort of thing. So I think Tim Davie himself, the Director General, has acknowledged that perhaps they need to look again at their complaints process, at the procedures when a complaint against a senior figure is red flagged as something that's very serious. I think there are perhaps some legitimate questions about whether they moved swiftly enough, but you have to balance that against the fact that there are huge numbers of complaints made every week about BBC figures.
Well, there are. And look, I think just to pick you up on that, there are, but I don't think there will be many complaints of this severity against the face of BBC News, would be my counter to that. I still think it's ridiculous. The BBC, in 7 weeks after this was reported to them by the family directly about their concerns about what was happening with their son, that it took 7 weeks and just one standard email and one phone call that didn't get connected. That was their attempt at following up what was obviously, on the face of it, potentially extremely serious charges, as indeed Tim Davie, the Director General of the BBC, has conceded they were. So I wouldn't necessarily go along, I think, with your defence of the way the BBC handled it. I actually think it's been a little bit shambolic. But
can I just pick you up on that point, Piers?
Yeah.
Because you should also bear in mind that the young person at the centre of the very first allegation, the allegation that Huw Edwards, as we now know it is, had paid money to someone for explicit images. The young person at the centre of that said the claims that were made and reported in The Sun about this were rubbish, and that there had been nothing illegal or improper that had taken place. So there are also two sides to that, and neither you nor I nor anyone else knows the truth of that at the moment.
Yeah, I don't have any inside knowledge of what The Sun has in terms of evidence, but what I do know is this young man is clearly pretty damaged. He's apparently a crack cocaine addict, so I'm not entirely sure that we should take everything he may be saying after this as you know, I'd love to have him on the programme and talk about it, but I don't think he can. So I think it's complicated. Then we go to David Elstein, top media executive, used to work at the BBC. David, from a corporate position, as a television executive, How do you think the BBC have handled this, and what do they do now about Huw Edwards?
Well, I think they've mishandled it, but for a completely different reason. I'm actually quite shocked to discover that the BBC has an internal investigations unit which might inquire into its employees' private lives. I think that's wholly inappropriate. And I hope the first thing that happens is that that unit is shut down. Look, when the complainant first appeared, they said there has been no, according to the police whom they talked to, there's been no criminality. So what is the BBC meant to do? When someone says one of your employees has been sending my child a lot of money, it's not a crime. Where is the BBC's role in all of this? So to say that they were slow...
let me pick you up on that. On that point, though, does it need to be a crime to still be inappropriate behaviour by the head of BBC News?
Hang on a minute. How do we know there's inappropriate behaviour, and is paying somebody £35,000 inappropriate? I mean, you can afford to pay someone £35,000, I'm sure. Would Talk TV then fire you for doing so?
Well, I think it depends. I think there are lots of unanswered questions, I agree. But to my knowledge so far, there's been no denial of the payment of £35,000 to a young person who we know is apparently addicted to crack cocaine. That does seem to me to probably stray into the area, if you're running the BBC, of potentially inappropriate conduct by the head of their news division, doesn't it?
Well, he's not the head of the news division, he's their lead presenter.
Well, he's the face of it. He's the face of it, yeah.
Of course. But if if the Sun publishes stuff which definitively shows that Huw Edwards did things which bring the BBC into disrepute, of course the BBC would then be entitled to say, you're in breach of contract, we suspend you, we don't renew your contract, we fire you, all of those things. But it's not for the BBC to be an arm of the police, to be an arm of the National Health Service, as was being suggested in the last panel discussion, sending help to drug addicts. How do we know that this young person is a severely damaged crack cocaine addict? We only hear it through the Sun from his mother and stepmother, and he denies everything that they say. So if I were the BBC, I'd be no further off than the police have been in saying nothing to see here. So my view of this is the BBC were quite wrong to allow it to be turned into a BBC story. It was a story about a BBC employee, a big story about a BBC employee. The chances are that he was going to be resigning or taking sick leave or whatever in due course anyway. But for the BBC to insert itself into the investigative process was inappropriate and wrong.
OK. David, thank you. Thank you, Carol. All right, let's come to my panel here in New York. Douglas, well, you've heard two people there and their views. What's your view about this story?
My view is that, I mean, essentially, the British public have been watching on in recent months. It looks like a very bad time to be a television presenter in Britain at the moment, doesn't it? And there's something sort of baffling, I think, to the general public about this. There have been these two massive scandals of two of the most prominent faces in television.
Philip Schofield and now
Huw Edwards. I think there are lots of things to take in mind. I agree with some of what's been said. I mean, effectively, we're back into the old problem of actually it's a problem at the BBC of oversight of BBC procedures. The BBC, of course, always quite understandably comes into the headlights and the firing line of everybody else because, everybody's got criticism of the BBC. The BBC always tries to please every party and very often it fails to please any party. So it seems to be it's something to do with BBC governance and oversight that's the issue here. I'd say two other things. One is the whole thing of, we have to go to mental health hospitals and all this sort of thing. Men are idiots, and men are idiots a lot. And I do think that the sort of pathologizing of men making mistakes into always having to be a mental health issue is you know, maybe something to be discussed another day, but it is a problem, that. And the second thing I'd just add to that is that whenever we look at a case like this, you know, we've just got to remember that there are a lot of different agendas that are going to go on behind this. There are going to be people who are going to come out with for Team Huw Edwards. There are going to be not that many at the moment. There are going to be others that come out for, you know, the young man. And we just heard about the possibility that this young man is a well-adjusted crack cocaine addict, which I don't think is very likely at all. But you know, it's just a difficult, ugly, and complex story. I don't look to newscasters to moral guidance. I don't look to them for good behaviour or anything else. But much of the country just doesn't want to know about the private life of Huw Edwards. It's now out there, and for him, I'd have thought that's just career-wise a terrible place to be in.
Louise, I think there's a lot of feelings you can have about this. You can feel sorry for Huw Edwards, that he's in this awful condition. He's in hospital. He's a well-documented depressive. He's had problems with this before. On a human level, I know him a bit. I feel sorry for the situation he's in. But I also need to know more about what's been going on before you can, I think, make any broad brushstroke judgments about what he's done wrong and what the BBC should do in response to that, given that he is effectively the face of BBC News.
Yeah, I don't think we can muddy the waters here. There are two separate issues. One is he's depressed, and he's been depressed for a long time. I'm very sorry for him for that. Genuinely, that's terrible. What he has done, allegedly, to these vulnerable young people is something else altogether. And listening to your other guests, I wonder if we're reading the same story, because I heard absolutely nothing of concern for the alleged victims that have come forward so far. Also, let me just say right now, it's not true that these allegations, all of the allegations, are unproven. The second accuser didn't go to The Sun. They went directly to the BBC and they said, I didn't want to meet up offline, he bullied me, he threatened me, and the BBC themselves reported that they had checked Huw Edwards, as we now know, phone, and that, yes, indeed, those threatening messages came from him. So if everybody, I think, should stop feeling sorry for Mr. Edwards in terms of what he allegedly did to these people, that's not okay. And I also do think that we have to draw a distinction between conduct that's illegal, which the police say there's no evidence of, and conduct that's unethical and that's immoral. The BBC is funded by everybody in Britain through the licence fee. If you pay TV, you have to pay the BBC. We do have a right to ask its highest paid employees that maybe they should have some care for young people, not threaten them, not bully them, that we know factually did actually happen. Is that okay? Would it be okay in any other organisation?
No, and it's interesting to me to see this sort of sun bashing that's going on against the sort of the beastly tabloids doing all this. The BBC have now done 2 separate exposés of Huw Edwards in the last 48 hours about his alleged inappropriate behaviour, including today, reportedly towards colleagues at the BBC. That's something to do with The Sun. That's to do with the BBC themselves unearthing stuff that they believe is worthy of reporting. So it's much more nuanced, I think, than people are trying to make out. This is just the Sun invading his privacy. I don't think it's as simple as that at all. Kevin, you've been sitting very patiently listening to all this. I guess your perspective that would be interesting to me is, from a purely business point of view, you've got a guy, the BBC is a global brand. It's a global brand that really requires trust. It's paid for by the British taxpayer, and that carries with it the brand of the BBC. Total trust, you know, that's his great sort of calling card, if you like. When the face of BBC News, the person chosen to announce the death of the monarch, for example, when that person is seen to have behaved in this alleged way in his private life, even if it doesn't stray into criminality, and we still don't know that yet over all these allegations, would the behaviour itself be inappropriate enough to justify the BBC firing him? And should they have handled this differently from the moment they first had the allegations come to them?
It's the question, because I look at it from several verticals. The BBC as an institution and a brand in the financial markets worldwide is one of the 3 outlets that all of us listen to every day, because we look for 5 major stories to make financial decisions on daily. It starts in North America here at about 5 in the morning. And the BBC has a different spin on all of them that North American outlets have, or even Canadian. There's an equivalent organization called the CBC in Canada, which is often listened to by New York financial managers as well for the North American continent. But this volatility in presenters and columnists on all sides of the pond has been extreme in the last 12 months, because we're trying to figure out how do you maintain the brand, as you just spoke to the CBC. Will this change in any way my viewership, which has now been 50 years? I've been watching the BBC almost daily for 50 years.
Have you really?
50 years. I lived in Cyprus for a while, Tunisia, Cambodia,
Right.
Ethiopia. The BBC is where we got our news. I was globe hopping for decades. And so in 2 weeks, will this make any difference? And the answer is no. This narrative in the next 24 hours is going to shift away from Huw. And I feel sorry, as we all do, the pressure he must be under. But I'd add this to it. When you dedicate your life to be a presenter or a news reader, as we call them here in America, you have to give up certain things. And there's no question about this. If you have flaws in your personality, you're dealing with your own demon, because there is no question 100% that one day they will cause your demise as a presenter or a columnist, because there is zero tolerance at the institutional level, whether it's BBC or any American network or streaming service. Today, zero tolerance. And the way you can measure this is look at the morality clauses that have made their way into every presenter's
Yeah, that's
contract.
true.
Absolutely.
And that's changed
In the last 36 months, every network that puts a presenter on as a contributor, whether they're a columnist or a newsreader, has a morality clause in it, so that you can pull that ripcord and, to the extent that you can, save the institution. Because Huw, there is no coming back from this, even if half of these allegations are true. But he, unfortunately, will not be part of the narrative in 24 hours.
Right. Douglas, let me just ask you about the aspect of his sexuality. Here's a guy who's married with 5 kids. He's talked about being a regular churchgoer and so on. And he appears to have been, having some kind of relationship. And we don't know the exact nature of what that is, but apparently he was exchanging for money for sexually explicit pictures and so on. That's one of the reasons why he wasn't named originally, was because you can't out people. Right. In this day and age, the media, and they would get into big trouble if they did. So, in a way, he was sort of oddly protected in that sense for a few days.
As was Philip Schofield.
Well, for a while, yeah, and that is a concern. Should it matter? I mean, if you're Huw Edwards and you're presenting the news, should it matter if you have a confused sexuality, if you're leading a double life, whatever? Does that actually matter to your ability to read the news and be trusted to do so?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, as I say, I think there's a problem, always a problem in the BBC about oversight. And the BBC always gets into trouble because it tries to cover things over. That's been the case historically. And it is a taxpayer-funded institution. It's different from other media. And so perhaps it's right to have a different set of expectations. But as for the sort of, as it were, morality thing, as I said before, I don't look to newsreaders for morality. But there's something very strange that is going on in Britain at the moment. I actually wrote my column about this in The Spectator this week, is the public behave in a different way to the expectations we have of a lot of public figures. I mean, a lot of the public are on dating apps, for instance. Yeah. If it's true that Huw Edwards was on a dating app and nothing illegal happened, do we expect...
Well, then he's really only accountable, isn't he, Louise, to his wife and family?
Exactly.
Isn't
He's
he?
accountable to
ultimately,
them.
I mean...
Absolutely, but here's where I object to people saying this is about Huw Edwards' private life. No, it isn't. If Huw Edwards had just had a boyfriend, a male lover, and everything was free and equal between them, then it's none of our beeswax, absolutely, and the BBC shouldn't be looking into it. Those aren't the allegations. It's not an allegation about Huw Edwards' private life. It's an allegation of causing harm to others, bullying, threatening, and so forth. That's where it steps out of your private life, whatever your sexuality.
And again, just to repeat,
whatever.
All those allegations are coming from the BBC themselves and their own independent investigations into their star presenter. And I think when the media trial starts, as it already is, yeah, fine if you want to try and criticise The Sun, who never named him, but the BBC have been doing their own reporting and unearthing material they believe is worthy of reporting of his alleged inappropriate behaviour, including to BBC colleagues.
The BBC should thank The Sun for doing the job that they themselves so woefully failed to do. The second accuser, who came directly to the BBC, wouldn't have come forward if the first story hadn't broken in The Sun.
Thank you to my panel. Great to see you, Kevin. Thank you very much indeed for coming on. I appreciate you pivoting to this big story coming out of our pond. But as you say, you've been a BBC viewer for 50 years, so probably nobody more expert to talk about it. So I appreciate you joining us today, and thank you to Douglas and to Louise. I appreciate it.